Hey guys, how's it going? Gilly here from the Retro Oasis, and today I have a review of the new Razer Kishi V2. This is a new Android smartphone controller from Razer that promises a few improvements over its predecessor. So let's check it out. Welcome to the Oasis. Let's start with the unboxing. We have the controller, those two spacers, and a manual. Right away I can tell many changes from its predecessor. The buttons A, B, X and Y are smaller. The thumbsticks changed. They are the same used on the Nintendo Switch and on most Chinese handhelds. The D-pad is different. We have a couple of extra buttons on top. The telescopic part is bigger. Now we have more smartphone compatibility. And the weight. This one is lighter with only 124 grams. The previous version weighs 160 grams. The GuiSeagal X2 is heavier with 169 grams. And the GuiSeagal X3 that has just been released is even heavier with 292 grams. Let's check the layout. Asymmetrical thumbsticks, same as the Nintendo Switch. The D-pad, option button, share button for screenshots or screen recording using Razer's app, face buttons, LED light here. Here the Razer Nexus button to open Razer's app, or if you don't have the app installed, works as a home button. Down here the menu button and those two gaps here work as a little tunnel for the sound to come out. The previous version also had that. On top the shoulder buttons and the additional M1 and M2 buttons that can be mapped with Razer's app. And on the bottom, the USB Type-C port to charge your smartphone when you're using the controller. I think by now everybody knows these analog sticks. It's one of the many changes from the first one. I have to admit I prefer the old ones, with more pivot. Have a look. But this change is not a big problem to me. I'm used to the Nintendo Switch. The D-pad, despite being similar to the previous version, is a bit smaller with 23.9mm. The V1 is 24.8mm. The one on the GameSeagal X2 is even smaller with 20mm and 21.9mm on the GameSeagal X3. As I mentioned, it's very similar to the previous version, but it has a little bit of texture on it. As you can see here, the first one is glossy, but the biggest change is the removal of the rubber membrane. The Razer Kishi V2 is using the same microswitch technology as the GameSeagal X2 and X3 in almost all of its buttons, with the exception these ones here. And the L2 and R2 triggers that are analog. Personally, I prefer D-pads with rubber membrane. I think it's more comfortable for long gaming sessions, but honestly it's very responsive. No issues playing fighting games. We have a very short travel distance here, and when pressed, they stay quite high above the body. The face buttons here, I don't mind they being microswitch. They also have a very short travel distance, which is great for quick time event games like God of War, for example. When pressed, they stay way above the shell. And as I said, they are smaller than the first version with 7.6mm. The V1 is 8.6mm. Bigger on the GameSeagal X3 with 8.4mm. And smaller on the GameSeagal X2 with 7mm. When you compare the right side of both controllers, you can see that the V2 is smaller. So it makes sense to have smaller buttons, I guess. They're very clicky and they make that mouse click sound. L1 and R1 also use micro switches just like M1 and M2. The triggers are the difference here being analog, which means they activate according to the pressure you put on them. I'll show you exactly what I mean later during a game test. I did love the additional buttons, but I'd prefer if they were on the back. But I still think they are well located, and I can access them using my index finger without hitting the other shoulder buttons. M1, M2 and L1 and R1 have a very short travel distance. On the other hand, the triggers have a much longer travel distance, being analog triggers. Alright, let's talk about build quality. I'd say it's average, but not in a bad way. Everything fits perfectly without sharp edges or leftover plastic. But I think because it's lighter in comparison with other controllers, it doesn't feel as premium. But I don't believe that's the case. Apparently, the plastic here is thinner to make the controller as light as possible. If you think about it, it makes sense. When you have a 300-gram controller plus the phone, it's not very comfortable for long playing sessions. This way, it's easier to hold the controller and also more portable. It's just when you compare, the V1 is heavier and with a thicker plastic. It does appear to be a better quality controller. But like I said, it's just a feeling. I believe the Razer's idea was to make this controller as light as possible. Another big change was the telescopic part of the controller. It's easier to fit the phone and it's sturdier. It's very simple. Open it, attach the phone, and close it. It's not as compact as the V1, but I must say I prefer the V2. The first one, besides not being compatible with as many smartphones, when the phone is attached, it doesn't feel very secure. You can see how it kind of moves around. If you check the V2, it feels more stable. And do you remember the spacers that I showed during the unboxing? If your phone is too thick, you can swap for these to make it fit. I even thought I would be able to use it without removing my phone's cover, but that's not the case here. The USB connection isn't long enough to connect the controller with the phone through the cover. Maybe it could work with a thinner case. And what's the maximum size for a smartphone to fit here? Phones with 17.5 centimeters or less would be compatible just fine. About the size, we have it here side by side with the V1. Here with the GameSir X2, the GameSir X3, here with a smartphone attached to the V1, here with the GameSir X3, and just out of curiosity with the Nintendo Switch OLED and the AYN Odin Pro. Now let's talk about ergonomy. I think it improved a lot from the first Razer Kishi. For starters, they added this texture on the back that helps with the grip. I also noticed the distance between the right thumbstick and shoulder buttons is smaller, giving you better access to these buttons without hurting your wrists. Another thing is this little contour in this area here on both sides. My middle fingers fit perfectly and naturally, allowing me to hold the controller from there. On the previous version, there is this area that's a bit recessed where you can rest your fingers, and it helps, but the V2 is more comfortable in my opinion. My only real complaint is that they moved the right thumbsticks right below the face buttons, causing the same issue I have with the GameSir X2, GameSir X3, the GPD XP and others. When I press the X and A together, which is very common in retro games and emulation, my fingers end up hitting this thumbstick. It's not as bad as the GameSir controllers, where the analog is quite tall and really gets in the way. On the V2, they're a bit more recessed. It's not perfect, but it's not that bad. The same way the first Kishi controller has a dedicated app called Kishi, the V2 also has one called Nexus that you can download at the Play Store. This app is basically a launcher. If you slide your apps to the left, there is a button Add Games. Here you can add games or apps you want to use with this launcher. Up here in settings, there are some interesting options like connecting your Facebook Live account or YouTube to stream straight from the phone. In remapping, you are able to map those additional M1, M2 buttons using them as any other button, with the exception of L2 and R2. And in firmware, you can update the controller. And using the Nexus app, when you press the share button, you can take a screenshot, record, or stream straight from your device. And the Nexus button here can be used to open the app or go back to your phone's interface at any time. Some people ask me if games like Fortnite or Call of Duty will work with this controller, and unfortunately it doesn't, unless you use a mapping app from a third party. These games usually only work with specific controllers like Xbox or PlayStation. So if you want to play these games, you have an extra step mapping your controller with another app. And before we start testing games, I want to check the charging port. If I plug a fast charger on my Red Magic 7, obviously it gives me fast charging because my phone supports it. It's this new charge here. As you can see, the cooler starts when fast charging is on. But if I use the same charger connected on the V2, it gives me regular charging. You can see here that the cooler is off. So unfortunately, you won't have fast charging when using pass-through. Finally, let's test the controller playing some games. This is a great controller for emulation. If the emulator has support for controllers, it will work with the Kishi V2. You might have to map the buttons depending on the emulator, but it will work perfectly once you do. And you only have to do this once. Here we have Diablo Immortal, and this is a game that has controller support. Here, Forza Horizon 5 on the xCloud. And now we can appreciate the advantage of analog triggers. You can hit the gas just a bit or floor it. But this kind of control is awesome for racing games and gives you a more immersive experience. When testing a PC game using Steam Link, it is recognized automatically, as you can see here, Razer Kishi V2, and it works beautifully. The Razer Kishi V2 has considerable improvements compared to its predecessor. Among them, a bigger and sturdier telescopic part that allows you to fit a better range of phones, the 2 additional mappable buttons up here, better ergonomics, more comfortable and secure with the addition of this texture on the back, the Nexus app that can be used as a launcher and gives you screen capture and streaming, and all of this in a lighter package than before. One of the things that I didn't like was the removal of the rubber membrane from the D-pad. Despite being very responsive, as you could see from the Street Fighter V demo, I still prefer the previous version. The thumbsticks are not a major problem, but I must say I also prefer the previous version. Still, I believe that in general the V2 is a better controller when compared to the first one. For alternatives, we have the first Razer Kishi that with the release of the V2 on the market, you can find it a bit cheaper. I still think it is a great controller. And we also have the GameSure X2 and X3. The X2 offers a good bang for your buck with a proprietary button mapping software, and it can be used with the Nintendo Switch emulator XNS without any additional cost. But it doesn't have the same build quality, and it doesn't have analog triggers, and the D-pad is not so great when compared with the Razer Kishi V2. The GameSure X3 has a similar price to the V2 and some good features like the Active Cooler, removable customizable face buttons, thumbsticks and D-pad, and it's also compatible with the XNS emulator. But it misses the analog triggers, the build quality despite being good is not as great as the Razer Kishi, and it's a lot heavier with almost twice the weight of the Kishi. I hope this video have a chance to help you decide if the Razer Kishi V2 is a good option for you. And if it was useful to you in any way, don't forget to leave a like before you go, it's much appreciated. And if you like handheld consoles, retro gaming, emulation, or games in general, consider subscribing and hit that bell to get a notification for future videos. Once again, Gilly here from the Retro Oasis. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.